Hello, I'm Donald McCauley, and welcome to medicsvoices.com, where we talk to the key opinion leaders in health and medicine around the world. Today we're in the US, and I'm talking to Dr. David Rábago. David, you've had a fascinating medical career, but what's really interesting is you didn't start off in medicine.
That's true. When I was an undergraduate, I did not think that I would have a career in medicine. It really wasn't on the agenda. I come from a family of teachers, and I thought that I would become a teacher. I saw what my parents did. I liked what they did. They seemed to like what they did, and it really was the main choice. And so I became a middle and high school teacher in Milwaukee and Chicago in the US for several years.
Well, I don't think it was several years, it was quite a considerable period of time. Tell us about that and what made the decision to go into medicine.
Yes, it was several years, nine altogether. And I found myself, loving the work. The teaching was great. Students liked what I did. Parents really liked what I did. Even the administrators liked what I did. And that's really not always the case. But I found myself running out of ceiling, is how I think about it now. And I looked around and considered several other science-related careers. I was a math and science teacher. And medicine was left standing after eliminating a lot of choices. And I had a couple of students whose parents were physicians, and it was a small school and quite friendly, kind of intimate. And during one of the conferences with the parents, I asked if I could later talk with them about my own career. And they became actually mentors for me in a choice that later led to medicine. So I was lucky that way. I had some inside contact.
So tell us about medical school.
Medical school. Well, I went back to academics to complete some courses that I hadn't done as an undergraduate. There are programs called post-baccalaureate courses. So I did some summer courses, and then University of Wisconsin had an interesting program for what they called then non-traditional students. And so I was quite non-traditional 9 years later after undergraduate. And essentially, it involved taking gross anatomy as a summer student so that I wouldn't get clobbered by the first three big classes that were typical then in 1993 when I started medical school. And it made the transition from my teaching life to student life a little gentler. And indeed, it was a real success builder. I did fine, and the transition was nice.
So then when did family medicine become part of the story?
I think that I always knew I'd be a family doc. It has a lot to it has a lot to do with why I got into teaching to begin with. I'm a generalist, kind of by inclination and spirit, and family medicine seemed to fit that. Now, I definitely tried to keep an open mind throughout all my rotations with all my professors. Of course, I was giving fair shake to all of the specialties, and I think that was genuine. I did the best that I could with that, but I found myself leaning toward family medicine interest groups, hanging out with people who did that. I found some of my most inspiring professors in the family medicine department. It continues to be, and was especially at that time, a very inspirational place with some national leaders in various aspects of patient-oriented care at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So it became an easy choice, and as a specialty, and that program in Madison was my first choice as a medical student seeking a residency.
Well, the science and research component of your brain was still active very early because you did some research even as a resident.
Yeah, that is interesting. Between medical school and residency, I did a 1 year um, sort of informal internship with the University of Wisconsin Sleep Lab. And Dr. Terry Young, who was one of the pioneers in sleep medicine. That was an effort to get any experience that I could. And I literally shopped around from lab to lab saying, can you hire or even provide a volunteer position for someone interested in getting a little bit of experience in research? And I caught her on a day where she was frantically producing a grant text that was due momentarily, basically. And in those days, the due date was what time does the last FedEx flight leave the airport? Those were pre-electronic submissions. So she sent me this note with a lot of grammatical and punctuation errors saying, I can't help you right now. Talk to me in 2 days. And we interviewed later, and she said, yeah, I'd love to have you. And so I spent a year before residency in doing sleep research. And her lab was great, epidemiology lab. And I kind of I caught the bug, as they say.
Tell us more about this bug because you went on to do some absolutely fascinating research. I suppose respiratory related, I suppose you would call it.
Yes, absolutely. Um, I have to say, I have been the fortunate and grateful recipient of some serendipity, a little bit of, willpower on my part, and the fortunate meeting of people who ended up being my mentors for my career. The first person was Dr. Mike Fleming, who's actually best known for work in alcohol-related primary care and brief intervention. And he was the director of a fellowship program, a T32 fellowship program run by HRSA in the US. And he knew that I was interested in research early on, and he said, as a junior resident, I think as a first year resident, he said, well, if you ever want to do any more of that or talk about that, just let me know. And I did, and we did. And he said, what are you interested in? And before medical school, I had taken a class in some body mechanic work, massage therapy, and so forth. And I hung out with those people for a little while, and they were always talking about how great it was, and my scientific analytical mind saying, well, how great is it? And in fact, we don't know how great some of that stuff is, if it is great at all. And it kind of stuck in some brain cell, and I thought, well, maybe I can have some input in helping determine whether anything that they were talking about was great or not. One of the things that people were especially interested in, it was Chicago, people got colds a lot, was this nasal irrigation technique that is very old, comes from the Ayurvedic or yogic medical traditions. And again, serendipity, I had a rotation with a otolaryngologist who had developed a plastic nasal irrigation cup or neti pot. And I said, well, have you ever really tested this in an RCT? And she said, well, there are some not such great studies, and we did a little thing here, but no, the answer is no, we don't really have great data. So that became my first project. And Mike Fleming, who is nothing if not make no small plans, said, well, you should just do a little RCT during your residency. And I didn't know enough to say no to that. Uh, and so we did that, nights and weekends. And it didn't
So,
finish, of course, during residency. And then I had to do a fellowship to complete that and to start the second thing that the second area of interest of my research.
uh, to say you did a little RCT is really underplaying it a lot. I mean, you did a fantastic piece of work that really has achieved international relevance. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I think, well, thank you for that. Yeah, it was a good thing. And it has moved into conventional care, um, even in advance, I think, of some of the bigger trials that we would like to see. Um, Part of it is, yeah, hard work and kind of willpower. Part of it is great mentorship. It didn't cost a lot of money, and in those days it was a little simpler to do clinical intervention trials. We needed smaller teams, and there was less administrative burden. And but the department was generous, and I had some support. Um, the transition, I think, was partly also right place, right time. If I hadn't done that study, I think somebody would have. There are these moments where the next unsolved question is just right there. And we knew that nasal irrigation had been present for centuries. And we knew that because it had been studied a couple of times in methodologically not such strong ways with environmental issues like woodworkers, a little bit with upper respiratory infections and allergy, but nobody had really put the randomization scheme in that was needed. So we did that. And I mean, people do really feel better. Those who have significant sinonasal symptoms, rinsing out your nose just feels good and they love it. Not for everybody. Some people just don't love it. And that's true for many therapies, but enough do that I think that really patient interest drove a lot of this. People voted with their feet. And so it has become something that gets used for a lot of sinonasal conditions. That said, we don't have the big RCT that has a nasal irrigation as one of the arms, but we are now involved in a six-site, uh, multi-site study in which we'll enroll over 3,000 people in the US, in which nasal irrigation is part of the therapeutic regimen. So we love that that has become part of that. Um, and you can now buy it in any drugstore, where that was not true in 2002 when we did that work.
Now, I'm not going to buy this understated approach, David, because good researchers have one good idea that they run with their career, but great researchers have more than one idea. And you've had more than one research idea. Tell us about prolotherapy.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That's very kind. And again, I have to credit, so I'll credit a terrific mentor who sadly passed away long before his time in 2014, Jeff Patterson. Jeff Patterson was one of these guys that um, you love to work with because he's so enthusiastic, so optimistic, and so adored patient care that you just want to do things like he did. And one of the things that he developed was a technique called prolotherapy for chronic pain. Chronic pain, as you know, is a very big deal and it's getting worse. And he picked up this therapy from that was developed in the 50s and brought the teaching of it to a much higher level. He organized teaching. It's not typically taught in med school or residencies by programs that deal with chronic pain. But he picked it up as a family doc and said, we're just going to teach people how to do this in conferences, and we're going to do service learning projects in places that need this and organize it in that way. So we'll teach people the fundamentals, and then we'll take it on the road and teach it in real life in practical terms. And he was so enthusiastic about that. And I said, well, what's the evidence that it works? I know your patient outcomes are good anecdotally, but that's often not enough to convince a payer, like a third-party payer or a health system. What is the what's the research? And he said, well, frankly, it could be better. In fact, it could be a lot better. So we had those conversations when I was trying to decide whether or not to make research a part of my career in kind of a bigger way. And I talked with him about the possibility of um, assessing prolotherapy as part of of a career development plan, and he was enthusiastic. Mike Fleming said, absolutely. You could establish this study, again, an RCT, and maybe include some basic science work um, as part of a career development plan. So I wrote that, and in the US, we have a series of grants that funds early career researchers to learn more about that. And I wrote that and was very fortunate to receive that. It's a 5 year thing that kind of covers time, which is the scarcest resource for docs, of course, especially learning docs. Um, and I learned how to conduct randomized control trials better. And the first one that we did in prolotherapy was really something that I remain proud of. It was a nice study that involved Jeff. It involved Mike Fleming as my research mentor, and it involved Tom Best, one of our faculty then in sports medicine, who you know well. And he was instrumental in helping translate my clinical understanding of prolotherapy, bridging it to the research side with Mike, and adding a basic science component. And that wasn't really called translational research at the time, but it turned out to be an idea that was ahead of its time because now we're all about translational science and translational research. So I think that was part of why I was awarded that grant. And certainly we have tried to keep that going on both the nasal irrigation side and the prolotherapy side.
Now, you've talked about areas that are really pioneering. You've talked about randomized controlled trials in two particular fields and also about translational work, which so this is really exciting, interesting research. But I'd like to take it back to something else because you've now moved on to Penn State and your responsibility is with faculty development. So it kind of brings you back almost to your teaching career of mentorship and support. Tell us about that.
Well, it has the educator never left, is the bottom line. People, when I transitioned to medical school from being a teacher, they said that that's such a dramatic shift. And I said, well, sort of, but I didn't ever really see it. It's a very big shift. And I have always referred to it as a lateral move. Um, you're a student for some time when you're young, and then in my case, I became a teacher of people who were young, and then I became a learner. And as you become a more advanced learner, you start teaching the medical students and then the junior residents. I was a chief resident as a family medicine in the family medicine residency at UW. So I was more involved in teaching, and that never really went away. And then as a junior faculty, I was responsible for teaching residents inpatient and outpatient settings. And I always have loved all three of those things, clinical care and teaching and research. And I'm a real believer in academic medicine. When people ask what I do, I typically say I am an academic family physician, and it involves three things: treating patients, teaching learners, and conducting research. And I buy into all three of those, and I try to have all three of those be part of my life. Not every day, but a good day in any one of those things is a really good day. Now, later in my career, and with my wife, Alexandra Skerska, who does these three things as well, um, we had an offer to come to Penn State and from Wisconsin. We were not looking to move, but well, a couple of things happened. They made some strong offers. That is a thing. We were at a point in our with our family and our children where they could move. They were not fans of the move at first, but they understood. And we had what they call sometimes with couples a two-body problem. You know, uh, who do you move? Whose career do you move for? And what does the partner how does the partner deal with that? The move was actually, the magnet was actually her career because she was in a place to assume the vice chair of research. They were really looking for that job. They were planning to look for a person in vice chair of faculty development. Penn State has a large department, and no one in charge of helping clinicians move through their career across all three of those missions. And when they saw Alexandra's CV and she mentioned, well, my husband is kind of interested in this other thing, they wanted to see mine and they said, well, this is a good day. We would like to talk with both of you and kind of solve this two-body problem. So it was another example of right place, right time. And that has become my responsibility now, in addition to those other things, is creating an environment in which development across these missions on a kind of per doc basis. Not everybody is interested in all three, and yet I think that the academic family medicine department functions best in which everybody knows a little bit about all those three things, at least what's going on in those three things, and buys into the mission of all those three things. Um, that's the passion for me, that's the joy, I think this is part of how we win in academic medicine.
Now, you mentioned the three components, and we've spoken about the academic and we've spoken about the teaching, and you've won a number of research awards and had some fabulous publications. But there's a third component, and that's the clinical care of patients. And you're also recognized for your clinical care of patients. That must have been very rewarding.
It is. We don't we don't have great ways of assessing this, and patient comments is one of them. Um, I like it when I receive good feedback from patients. We're getting better at outcomes-based assessment, and I do find in outcomes-based work. I think that the combination of those two things is the win. When patients feel good about seeing their family physician and they are demonstrably healthier by objective metrics, then you're winning. And of course, we don't always win, but that's the goal, and I do like that. And both of the concerns that I've done research in come directly from the patient's perspective and the patient's care. Pain and upper respiratory infections are things that patients really care about. And they're things that have a big societal impact. So it, it was easy to say yes to those areas for research.
David, I think that's a particularly important note to end on, the focus on patient care. It's been terrific talking to you. It's been wonderful to have you as a friend and a colleague for so many years. And thank you very much for talking to us today.
Well, it's been my pleasure too. I always know it's going to be a great conversation when I bump into you at a conference. It has happened many times, unexpected each time, and each time a joy. So thank you very much for having me on the program.